Waitress begs on her knees after being assaulted, but didn't know she was being watched. Melissa Johnson was on her knees on the cold floor of the landmark restaurant in Denver, picking up shards of porcelain as tears streamed down her face. The elegant woman in the black dress kept shouting, humiliating her in front of all the customers who had stopped eating to watch the embarrassing scene. "You incompetent! You did this on purpose!" yelled Jessica Parker, an executive at one of the city's largest consulting firms. "You ruined my wedding anniversary dinner!" Melissa knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Jessica had pulled the tray from her hands when she approached the table, but no one else had noticed the subtle movement. Now, with shrimp sauce spread all over the marble floor and the broken plates forming a mosaic of humiliation, she could only repeat, "I'm sorry, Mom. It was an accident, I swear." What Melissa didn't know was that, at a distant table in the back of the room, a man in a grey suit was watching the entire situation closely. Brandon Thompson, a real estate businessman, had just arrived for a business dinner when he witnessed the scene. His eyes couldn't look away from the humiliated waitress. There was something familiar about that face, about those brown eyes glistening with tears. "Clean everything up on your knees," ordered Gregory Wilson, the restaurant manager, clearly nervous about Jessica's presence, an influential customer. "And you'll pay for the damage." Melissa swallowed her tears and began picking up the pieces of china with trembling hands. That's when she noticed something on Jessica's wrist, a small butterfly-shaped tattoo. Her heart raced. She knew that mark. Brandon discreetly took his phone out of his pocket and started filming, not out of morbid curiosity, but because something in his chest told him that scene was important. As he recorded, distant memories began to emerge. Those eyes, he had seen them before. "You'll pay me $300 for the broken plates and the embarrassment," said Jessica, crossing her arms. "And another $200 for the clothes stained with the sauce. $500, almost all of Melissa's salary." She looked at the manager, hoping for some support, but Gregory just nodded. "You can deduct it from my salary," whispered Melissa, her voice choked. Jessica smiled scornfully and opened her purse to take out some papers. "Sign here acknowledging your guilt," she ordered, extending a sheet she took from a leather folder. While searching for a pen in her bag, some documents fell to the floor. Brandon sharpened his gaze and managed to read a heading. "Power of attorney for sale. Grace Children's Home." His blood ran cold. That was the orphanage where he had grown up. Melissa hesitated before signing. She looked again at the tattoo on Jessica's wrist, and a certainty filled her chest. She knew that woman, knew her very well. With steady hands, she signed the document, but instead of Melissa Johnson, she wrote Melissa Brown, the surname she used at the orphanage before adoption. "There," she said, handing back the paper. "Can I get back to work?" Jessica put the document away without checking the signature and turned to the man who had just arrived at the table. "Oh, Richard, you're finally here," she said coldly to her husband, a middle-aged lawyer carrying a leather briefcase with a discreet logo. Grace Children's Foundation. Richard Parker looked at the mess on the floor and then at his wife. "What happened here?" he asked, clearly embarrassed. "An incompetent waitress ruined our evening," Jessica replied loudly, wanting everyone to hear. "But it's all settled now. She's going to pay for the damage." Richard looked at Melissa with an expression that mixed pity and recognition. He too had noticed something familiar about that face. "Jessica, don't you think you're overreacting? It was just an accident." "Overreacting?" she shouted, making all the customers look again. "You always defend me last. First it's others, then it's me." Richard's humiliation was public and cruel. Melissa felt sorry for him, but kept picking up the broken pieces. That's when she noticed the briefcase Richard was carrying had a specific label, Sale Project, Lot 247. She knew that number. It was the land where the children's home stood. Brandon watched everything from his table, his heart racing. It couldn't be a coincidence. That waitress, that cruel executive, and that embarrassed lawyer were all connected to his past somehow. When Melissa finally finished cleaning and stood up to get cloths to dry the floor, Brandon discreetly approached, pretending to go to the restroom. "Don't react," he whispered to her as he passed. "Trust me. Don't react to what the woman says. This is important." Melissa looked into his eyes and froze. Those green eyes. She remembered them. They were the eyes of the boy who slept in the bunk next to hers at the children's home. Brandon, her foster brother. He continued to the restroom and she returned to the couple's table, trying to process what was happening. Brandon had grown up and become a businessman, but she recognized him immediately. The question pounding in her head was, what was he doing there? When she returned with the cloths, Jessica was still taking her anger out on Richard. "You never support me when I need it. You always embarrass me." "Lower your voice, Jessica," Richard pleaded, red with shame. "People are staring. Let them stare. Let them. I want everyone to see how my own husband treats me." Melissa finished drying the floor and was about to walk away when Jessica called her again. "Hey, you there," she shouted. "Bring the bill, and don't forget to include the $500 you owe me." While Melissa went to get the bill, Brandon discreetly returned to his table. He had photographed some of the documents that fell from Jessica's bag with his phone. What he saw left him in shock. It wasn't just a power of attorney to sell the children's home. There were fraudulent donation transfer documents, misappropriation of funds meant for the children, and forged signatures of former residents to approve the sale of the land. Melissa returned with the bill and handed it to Richard, who paid silently. Before leaving, Jessica turned to her one last time. "I hope you've learned your lesson," she said with a cruel smile. "Next time, be more careful about who you're serving." The couple left, and the restaurant gradually returned to normal. Melissa went to the staff locker room and broke down in tears. Gregory appeared minutes later. "Melissa, I'm sorry about what happened," he said, but his voice didn't sound sincere. "You know I can't upset customers like Mrs. Jessica. She has a lot of influence in the city. I know, Mr. Gregory, it wasn't your fault. The $500 will be deducted from your salary over the next 3 months. $100 per month plus the $50 I already deduct for food. Do you agree?" Melissa agreed, because she had no choice. $150 less per month meant she would barely be able to pay the rent for the small room she shared with 2 other waitresses in the Rhino district. When she left the restaurant that night, Melissa found Brandon waiting for her on the corner. "Mel," he said, using the nickname only he used at the children's home. "It's me, Brandon, do you remember?" She ran into his arms and cried as she hadn't cried in years. "Brandon, my God, how did you find me?" "I didn't find you," he said, stroking her hair. "Fate brought us back together, and I don't think it was by accident." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. They went to a cafe that stayed open late and talked for hours. Brandon shared how he had been adopted by a wealthy family at 12 and how that changed his life. Melissa spoke about the foster homes she had been through, most of them problematic, until she could emancipate herself at 18 and start working. "Mel, I need to tell you something," said Brandon, showing photos of documents on his phone. "That woman who humiliated you today, she's stealing from the children's home." Melissa looked at the images and felt the world spin. They were official documents stamped, with signatures she recognized. Signatures of children who had grown up with them at the children's home. "How did she get these signatures?" she asked. "That's what we need to find out. But first, tell me one thing. Do you recognize that woman? That tattoo on her wrist?" "Jessica Christine Smith," Melissa said slowly. "She also grew up in the children's home. She was 2 years younger than me. She was always cruel to the younger girls, but the nuns never saw it because she was too clever to get caught. So she changed her name when she was adopted. Apparently, yes, to Jessica Parker, and she married that lawyer who works for the foundation." Brandon slammed his fist on the table. "That's it. She's using her husband's position to forge documents and sell the children's home's land. But for it to be legal, she needs approval from all former residents." "How many were we?" asked Melissa. "In our time, about 20-something. But over the years, hundreds of children passed through there." Melissa grew thoughtful. Brandon, she didn't recognize me today. I'm sure of it. And I signed that paper with my name from the children's home, not my current one. Why? Instinct. Something told me to do that. Brandon smiled. Still the same clever Mel as always. That means the signature is legally invalid. But what about the others? If she's collecting signatures, then we need to warn them before it's too late. They spent the night planning how to investigate Jessica's scheme. Brandon had resources and contacts. Melissa had knowledge about the people from the children's home and access to the restaurant where Jessica often had lunch. The next day, Melissa arrived at work determined. Gregory called her early. "Melissa, I need to tell you something," he said nervously. "Mrs. Jessica called this morning. She wants you to be the exclusive waitress for her table whenever she comes here." "What do you mean?" "She said she liked your humility, wants you to always serve her personally." Melissa swallowed her disgust and agreed. It was the perfect opportunity to investigate. During the following week, Jessica appeared at the restaurant 3 times, always for business lunches, always treating Melissa as if she were invisible. But Melissa watched and listened to everything. On one of these occasions, Jessica was having lunch with an older woman whom Melissa recognized, Mrs. Helen, who had worked as a cook at the children's home for over 20 years. "Mrs. Helen," Jessica said in a syrupy tone, "you were so important in my childhood. Now that I'm able, I want to give back." "Oh, my dear Jessica, you were always a special girl," replied the elderly lady. "That's why I want you to sign this document. It's to ensure the children's home is sold, and the money is invested in something better for the children, a modern school with technology." Mrs. Helen, who could barely read, signed the paper without question. Melissa watched everything in horror. Jessica was deceiving, trusting, naive people. That night, Melissa told everything to Brandon. "She's collecting signatures from people who weren't even residents of the children's home," she said. "Mrs. Helen was an employee." "That's ideological falsification," replied Brandon. "We need more concrete evidence." "What if I recorded a conversation?" "It's risky. If she finds out—" "Brandon, I endured 20 years of humiliation in bad foster homes. I can handle a few more weeks pretending to be submissive to this woman." They bought a small recorder that Melissa hid in her uniform. During the following weeks, she managed to record several incriminating conversations of Jessica. In one of them, Jessica was talking on the phone while having lunch alone. "Yes, I've already gotten 15 signatures. No, they don't really know what they're signing. Richard is very naive. He believes everything I say. The money from the sale goes straight to our offshore account." Melissa almost dropped her tray when she heard that. Jessica wasn't just selling the land illegally, she was stealing money meant for the children. But the most shocking revelation came 2 weeks later, when Richard showed up at the restaurant alone and specifically asked to be served by Melissa. "Miss," he said quietly, "may I speak with you privately?" They went to a more secluded corner of the restaurant. "I know who you are," said Richard. "Melissa Johnson, former resident of Grace Children's Home, adopted by the Brown family at 16. Melissa froze. "I also know that your wife is Jessica Christine Smith, also a former resident, adopted by the Parker family at 15. Richard took a deep breath. "She doesn't know I discovered her past, and she also doesn't know I uncovered the scheme." "What scheme?" "She's forging documents to sell the children's home property. The sale money, which should go to a charitable foundation, is being diverted." "Why are you telling me this?" Richard looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Because she's blackmailing me. She found out I committed some irregularities at the office years ago. Nothing too serious, but enough to get me disbarred." "And what does that have to do with me?" "She said if I don't help with the fake documents, she'll report me. But I can't live like this anymore. I want to help you stop her." Melissa remained silent for a few seconds, processing the information. "What do you want from me?" "An alliance. You have access to her here at the restaurant. I have access to the documents at the office. Together we can gather enough evidence to stop her. And then we go to the police and tell them everything." Melissa agreed, but didn't tell Richard about Brandon. Instinctively, she felt the fewer people who knew all the details, the better. That night, she told Brandon everything and he became euphoric. "Mel, this is perfect. With Richard on our side, we have direct access to the original documents. But what if it's a trap?" "It's not. I investigated Richard. He really did commit some minor irregularities years ago, but nothing that justifies this blackmail. Jessica must be putting a lot of pressure on him to take such a risk." During the following days, Richard began passing information to Melissa, photocopied documents, recordings of conversations he had with Jessica, evidence of the scheme. What they discovered was worse than they had imagined. Jessica wasn't just selling the children's home. She had been diverting donations that came to the foundation for over 5 years. Thousands of dollars that should have gone to facility improvements, food, and clothes for the children. "My God," said Melissa when Brandon showed her the numbers. "How many children could have been helped with this money?" "Hundreds," replied Brandon, anger in his voice, "and she spent it all on expensive clothes, cars, trips." That's when Melissa had an idea. "Brandon, what if we don't just go to the police? And what do you mean? And what if we confront her directly, record everything?" "That's very dangerous." "Maybe, but it could also be our chance to make her confess everything. If she feels cornered, she might say more than she should." Brandon thought for a few minutes. "How would you do that?" "Richard said she's coming here on Friday for a lunch with investors who want to buy the orphanage's land. What if I confronted her in front of them?" "Melissa, that's crazy. She could physically attack you." "Not in front of potential buyers. She'll try to keep her composure, but she might slip up and say something incriminating. They planned everything carefully." Brandon would be in the restaurant, discreetly filming. Richard would provide the original documents for Melissa to show as evidence, and Melissa would confront Jessica during the lunch. On Friday, Melissa was more nervous than ever. When Jessica arrived with 3 men in suits, she tried to act natural. "Good afternoon," said Melissa, pouring water for the table. "Would you like to order the usual?" Jessica completely ignored her, talking to the men about the excellent investment she was offering. "The land has a prime location," she was saying. "In 5 years it'll be worth triple what we're asking." "And all the documentation is in order?" asked one of the men. "Absolutely. We have approval from all former residents and the foundation." That's when Melissa decided to act. "Excuse me," she said, interrupting the conversation. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Jessica looked at her with irritation. "I'm busy. What do you want?" "It's about the Grace Children's Home. I grew up there too." The silence that fell over the table was sharp. Jessica paled, but tried to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said coldly. "Of course you do, Jessica Christine. Or should I call you Jessie like they did at the orphanage?" The men looked from Jessica to Melissa, confused. "Miss," said one of them, "could you give us some privacy?" "Actually," said Melissa, pulling out a hidden folder, "I think you gentlemen should see this before closing any deal." She opened the folder and spread the documents on the table. They were the evidence Richard had provided, the photos Brandon had taken, and the transcribed recordings. "These documents show the land sale is fraudulent," said Melissa, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Jessica is forging signatures and diverting money from donations meant for the children." Jessica stood up abruptly, knocking over her water glass. "That's a lie. This woman is making all this up for revenge." "Revenge for what?" asked one of the men. She works here. I complained about her service the other day and she got upset." Melissa smiled sadly. "It's true that you complained about my service. You even publicly humiliated me, made me clean the floor on my knees, and had me pay $500 for plates that you yourself broke." "This has nothing to do with these fake documents," shouted Jessica. "Fake?" said Melissa, picking up a specific sheet. "Then why is this signature here under the name of Mary Conception Miller, who was at the orphanage in 1987, but the document date is 2023? Mary died in 2019. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The silence that followed was deafening. The men looked at the documents, then at Jessica, then at Melissa. "How do you know when Mary was at the orphanage?" asked Jessica, her voice trembling. "Because I was there too, Jessie. I slept in the bunk bed next to yours. Do you remember the rag doll you broke that belonged to little Annie just out of spite? Jessica sat down heavily, her face as white as paper. We'll have to excuse ourselves, said one of the men, standing up. Obviously, there are serious legal matters involved in this business. We'll need a full investigation before proceeding. The three men quickly left, leaving Jessica alone with Melissa. What do you want? Asked Jessica, her voice defeated. The truth, and the return of the money you stole from the children. You don't understand, said Jessica, tears beginning to fall. I did all this because I wanted to forget that place, those horrible years. Horrible? Jessie, the children's home wasn't perfect, but the nuns took care of us. We had food, shelter, education. You don't remember what I went through there, said Jessica, sobbing. The older girls would hit me, hide my food, cut my hair while I slept. Melissa remembered. Jessica had indeed been bullied at the children's home, but instead of seeking help, she started doing the same to the younger girls. I remember, Jessie. I remember you suffered, but I also remember you started doing the same thing to the other girls. I was a child, I was angry, scared, and now you're an adult, and you're stealing from children who are going through the same things we went through. Jessica cried silently for a few minutes. When she composed herself, she looked at Melissa with an expression mixing despair and defiance. What do you want in exchange for your silence? I don't want anything in exchange. I want justice. Are you going to turn me into the police? That depends on you. What do you mean? Melissa sat in the chair across from Jessica. If you return all the money you stole, confess publicly, and commit to working to repair the damage caused, maybe we can find a solution that doesn't involve prison. And why would you do that for me? Because we're both orphans, Jessie. We know what it's like to have no one in the world. I don't want to destroy your life. I want you to fix the mistake. Jessica remained thoughtful for a long time. How much money are we talking about? According to the documents Richard showed me, about $200,000 in diverted donations over 5 years. 200,000, Jessica murmured. I don't have all that in cash. But you have assets. Car, apartment, jewelry. How do you know that? Melissa didn't answer. She didn't want to reveal Brandon's involvement yet. The question is, are you willing to return it? Jessica stood up and walked to the restaurant window. If I do this, Richard will leave me. My career will be over. I'll lose everything. And if you don't, you'll lose your freedom. Are you blackmailing me? I'm offering a chance at redemption. Jessica returned to the table. I need time to think. You have until Monday. If I don't have an answer by then, I'll go to the authorities. They parted without saying goodbye. Melissa went straight to meet Brandon, who was waiting in the car outside the restaurant. How did it go? He asked anxiously. She didn't deny it. In fact, she practically confessed to everything. Did you record anything? I recorded some parts, but most importantly, she admitted to stealing the donation money. And now? Now we wait until Monday to see what she decides. The weekend passed slowly. On Monday morning, Melissa arrived at work and found Gregory waiting for her at the entrance. Melissa, I need to speak with you, he said, clearly nervous. Did something happen? Ms. Jessica called this morning. She said you threatened her on Friday. Melissa felt her stomach drop. She said that? She said you made up stories about her past to try to get money, and that if you're not fired, she'll sue the restaurant. Mr. Gregory. Melissa, I like you. You're a good employee, but I can't upset a client like Mrs. Jessica. She has a lot of power in the city. So you're firing me? Gregory sighed. I'm sorry. Melissa collected her things from the locker and left the restaurant unemployed. On the sidewalk, she called Brandon. She got me fired, she said, crying. Calm down, Mel. Come here to the office. Let's decide our next steps. In Brandon's office, they reviewed all the evidence they had gathered. We have enough material for a formal complaint, said Brandon, but she's trying to get ahead, discrediting you. And now? Now we're going to do what we should have done from the start. We're going to the police station. They went to the Financial Crimes Unit and submitted all the documentation. The officer, Dr. Samuel Roberts, carefully examined the papers. "It's a complex case," he said. "We'll need a full investigation. It could take a few weeks." "And until then, she can keep embezzling money," protested Melissa. "We'll issue a warrant to freeze the accounts linked to the foundation. That will prevent further misappropriation." When they left the station, Brandon was worried. "Mel, did you notice we didn't mention Richard?" "I did. I think we should protect him for now. He could be our most important witness." "I agree. But what if Jessica finds out he gave us the information? Then we'll have to protect him somehow." That same afternoon, Richard called Melissa. "She knows," he said, his voice desperate. "Jessica found out I passed the documents to you." "How?" "She noticed some files were missing, and I made a mistake. I left a drawer unlocked." "What did she say?" "That if I don't retract everything I told you, she'll report me for all the irregularities I've committed over the years. Not just the small ones, but also some bigger ones I hid." "What bigger irregularities?" Richard was silent for a few seconds. "I forged some signatures on real estate contracts years ago. Nothing related to the children's home, it was other clients. But if that comes out, I'll go to jail. Richard, we can protect you if you testify against her. I can't take that risk. I have children, Melissa. I can't go to jail and leave them helpless. So what are you going to do?" "I'll have to deny everything. Say you fabricated the documents you showed me." The call ended, and Melissa stared at the phone, devastated. Without Richard, the case against Jessica was much weaker. The next morning, she received a summons to appear at the police station. When she arrived, she found Jessica already waiting, accompanied by a well-dressed lawyer. "Dr. Melissa," said Officer Samuel, "Mrs. Jessica is making a counter-accusation. She says you are slandering her and trying to extort money from her." "That's a lie," replied Melissa. "She has a recording of a conversation in which you apparently asked for money in exchange for not disclosing false information about her past." Melissa froze. Jessica had recorded part of the conversation at the restaurant, editing it to sound like blackmail. "Officer, can I hear this recording?" He played the audio. It was clearly edited, but it sounded convincing if you didn't know the context. "Furthermore," continued Jessica, "my husband, the lawyer Richard Parker, is here to testify that all the Foundation's documents are in perfect order." Richard entered the room, avoiding eye contact with Melissa. "Officer," he said, "as the lawyer for the Grace Children's Foundation, I can assure you that all financial transactions were conducted within the law. The documents that supposedly prove irregularities are forgeries." Melissa felt her world collapse. Richard was denying everything, just as he had said he would. "Miss Melissa," said the detective, "given this new information, I must warn you that you could be accused of slander and attempted extortion." "Officer, may I speak with my lawyer before making further statements?" "Of course, but you'll need to come back here next week for clarification." Melissa left the police station devastated. She called Brandon, who came to pick her up immediately. "Mel, this isn't over yet," he said, trying to comfort her. "We have other options." "What other options?" "Richard denied everything. The documents were questioned." "We still have the recordings you made at the restaurant." "Recordings that could be considered illegal if I didn't announce I was recording." They went to Brandon's house, a spacious apartment in the upscale part of the city. There they spent hours analyzing all the evidence they had. "Mel, there's one thing we haven't tried yet," said Brandon. "What?" "Looking for other people who grew up at the children's home. If we can prove she forged signatures of former residents, the case against her becomes much stronger." "But how are we going to find these people? It's been over 15 years since I left there." "Leave it to me. I have the resources to hire private investigators." During the following week, while Melissa prepared to return to the police station, Brandon worked tirelessly to locate former residents of the children's home. What they discovered was surprising. Brandon managed to find 12 people who had grown up there and who had supposedly signed documents authorizing the sale of the land. The problem was that 4 of these people were abroad. 3 had died, 2 didn't know how to write their own names, and 3 had never signed any document. "Mel, this is conclusive proof of forgery," said Brandon excitedly. "There's no way these signatures are real." "But how are we going to prove this at the police station without revealing that you hired investigators?" It might look like an elaborate setup. We'll need a different strategy. That's when Melissa had an idea. Brandon, what if we organized a gathering? Invited all the former residents of the children's home we could locate. What for? To confront Jessica publicly. If she had the nerve to forge the signatures, let her explain it in front of the very people. It's risky. She might not show up. She'll show up. I bet her ego won't let her run from a public confrontation. They decided to organize a meeting in the church hall that was near the site of the former children's home. Brandon paid for advertising in local newspapers and social media, calling former residents of the Grace Children's Home to a fellowship gathering. On the eve of the meeting, Melissa was nervous. What if few people showed up? What if Jessica really didn't come? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. On Saturday morning, Melissa arrived early at the church. To her surprise, there were already several people waiting. Men and women of different ages, some she recognized, others completely different from the boys and girls she remembered. "Melissa Johnson," shouted a woman with graying hair. "I'm Teresa. Do you remember me?" Melissa ran to hug her. Teresa had been like an older sister to her at the children's home. "Of course I remember. You taught me how to braid my hair." One by one, people kept arriving. In total, 18 former residents showed up. Some came from other cities just to attend the gathering. At 10 in the morning, when they were all chatting animatedly about old times, Jessica appeared at the church door. She was elegant as always, but visibly tense. "Hello, everyone," she said, trying to sound casual. The silence that fell was awkward. Some people recognized her, others didn't. "Jessie," said a tall, bald man. "Jessie Lynn." "Hi, John," she replied with a forced smile. Melissa stood up. "I'm glad you came, Jessica. We were just talking about the children's home." "Oh, really?" said Jessica, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes," continued Melissa, "mainly about the sale of the property." "What sale?" asked Teresa. "Jessica is selling the land where our children's home used to operate," explained Melissa. "And according to her, we all signed documents agreeing to it." A murmur spread through the group. "I never signed anything," said John. "Neither did I," said another woman. "Actually," said Melissa, picking up a folder, "I brought copies of the documents that Jessica presented for the sale. I'd like each of you to check if you really signed." Melissa distributed the copies and watched the reactions. One by one, people denied having made those signatures. "This isn't my handwriting," said an elderly man with glasses. "And this date is wrong," said a younger woman. "In 2022, I was in the hospital. I couldn't have signed anything." Jessica was growing paler by the minute. "There must have been some mistake," she said. "Maybe the documents you're seeing are old version." "Jessica," said Melissa firmly, "can you explain how you obtained Mary Conception Miller's signature, considering she passed away in 2019? The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know she had died," stammered Jessica. "And how do you explain Peter Henry Olson's signature, who has been living in Germany for 5 years and never returned to the United States?" Jessica looked around, seeing all the accusing eyes fixed on her. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to save the children's home." "Save it?" asked Teresa. "By selling it and keeping the money?" "It's not like that. The property was going to be seized due to debts. I was trying to sell it before it was too late." "What debts?" asked John. "The Grace Children's Foundation has always kept its accounts up to date." It was then that Jessica broke down. She began to cry convulsively and told everything. How she had embezzled money from donations over the years, how the debts piled up, how she forged the signatures to try to fix it all by selling the property. "I started by taking just a little," she sobbed. "It was to buy better clothes, to feel equal to the other women at my job. But then it became an addiction. I always needed more money to keep up appearances." Brandon, who had remained silent until then, stood up. "Jessica, you stole over $200,000 meant for orphaned children, money that could have changed dozens of lives." "I know," she said, crying. "I know, and I regret it every day." "Regret isn't enough," said one of the women. "You have to return that money." I don't have that money anymore, admitted Jessica. I spent it all. Then you'll have to sell your assets, said Melissa. Apartment, car, jewelry, everything. Jessica looked at each face around her and saw only disapproval and sadness. And if I do that, you won't press charges? People exchanged glances. That's not our decision, said John. It's up to the justice system. But, added Melissa, if you confess everything publicly, return the money, and commit to making amends, maybe we can ask the judge to consider your cooperation. What do you mean, publicly? In an interview with the local newspaper, telling the whole truth and apologizing to the children who were harmed. Jessica was silent for a few minutes, thinking. And Richard, my husband, what about him? He was involved too. He helped with some documents. Melissa and Brandon exchanged glances. They knew this, but preferred that Jessica herself reveal it. The decision about Richard is his own, said Melissa. But if he cooperates with the authorities, he might also receive some consideration. Jessica took a deep breath. I accept, she said. I'll confess everything and return what I can. In the following days, the case gained traction in the local media. Jessica's interview with the newspaper was published on the front page, with full details of the embezzlement scheme. Richard also decided to cooperate, confessing his involvement and providing documents that helped trace where the misappropriated money had gone. The legal process lasted 6 months. In the end, Jessica was sentenced to 2 years of semi-open imprisonment, but the sentence was converted to community service due to her cooperation and the fact that she had returned most of the money. Richard received a lighter penalty, being suspended from the bar for 2 years and ordered to pay a fine. The recovered money was used to completely renovate the old children's home, which was transformed into a shelter for children and adolescents in socially vulnerable situations. Melissa secured a new job as the center's coordinator, using her life experience to help the children. Brandon invested a significant amount of his own money into the project, becoming one of the institution's main supporters. The most surprising thing happened 6 months after the trial. Jessica, who was serving her sentence by doing community service at the center, asked to speak with Melissa. I wanted to thank you, she said, with tears in her eyes. Thank you for what? For giving me the chance to redeem myself, for not completely destroying me. Melissa looked at the woman who had once publicly humiliated her and saw only a broken person trying to rebuild herself. Jessie, we both know what it's like to have no family, to have no one in the world. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I completely destroyed you. Even after everything I did to you, at the restaurant, at the police station. Especially because of that. You were trying to save yourself the only way you knew how, by attacking others. But that never works in the long run. Jessica worked at the center for over a year after officially completing her sentence. She became a dedicated employee, especially good at dealing with children who displayed aggressive behavior. I understand them, she told Melissa one day. I know what it's like to be angry at the whole world. The center thrived. With the recovered money and donations that started coming in after the case's publicity, they were able to care for nearly 50 children. They had classrooms, vocational workshops, a spacious dining hall, and comfortable dormitories. Richard, after serving his suspension, returned to practicing law, but now provided free services to the center, helping the children with legal matters such as documentation and adoption processes. On the first anniversary of the renovated center, they held a big celebration. Several former residents of the children's home, staff, children in care, and their families attended. During the party, Melissa stepped onto the makeshift stage to give a speech. 2 years ago, she said, I was working as a waitress when I was publicly humiliated by a customer. At that moment, I didn't know that humiliation would change the lives of dozens of children. The audience applauded. We've learned that sometimes what seems like the worst thing that can happen to us is actually the beginning of something much better. Pain can teach us, anger can motivate us, and forgiveness can set us free. Melissa looked at Jessica, who was at the back of the hall, helping serve dinner to the children. Today we have a center that cares for children who need love and opportunities. We have a dedicated team that includes people who have made mistakes and learned from them, and we have proof that it's possible to turn a story of pain into one of hope. The party lasted until late. As it was winding down, Jessica approached Melissa. "Mel, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you forgive me?" "Really?" Melissa thought for a few seconds before answering. "Because I learned that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And because I realized that deep down you were a hurt child trying to survive the only way you knew how." "And now?" "Now you're an adult woman who has the chance to choose to be different. And from what I see here at the center, you're making that choice every day." They hugged and stayed that way for several minutes, two women who had grown up in the same place, taken different paths, hurt each other, and finally found a way to heal old wounds. 3 years later, the center had become a reference in the region. Melissa was promoted to director, Brandon became chairman of the board, and Jessica was officially hired as a social psychologist after completing a degree in social work. Richard continued providing pro bono services and eventually became the institution's official attorney. One Thursday afternoon, Melissa was in her office when Brandon appeared with an official letter. "Mel, an interesting proposal has arrived." "What kind of proposal?" "The state government wants to use our model to create similar centers in other cities, and they want you to coordinate the project." Melissa read the letter and smiled. "That would mean traveling a lot, training other people. It would mean taking our experience to hundreds of other children." "What about the center here?" "Jessica can take over as director. She already knows all the operations and has the children's trust." Melissa looked out the office window and saw Jessica in the courtyard, jumping rope with a group of girls. It was hard to believe that this was the same woman who had humiliated her years before. "Do you think she's ready for this responsibility?" "I think that's the wrong question," said Brandon. "The right question is, are you ready to trust her?" Melissa smiled. "Yes, I am." 6 months later, at the ceremony for Jessica's inauguration as the new center director, Melissa gave her farewell speech. "When we started this project, I thought I was helping orphaned children. Today I realize I was also helping the orphaned child that still existed within me and within every person involved in this work." She looked at Jessica, who was in the front row. "I learned that true victory isn't defeating our enemies, but turning them into allies. It's not avoiding pain, but using that pain for something constructive." The ceremony was moving. Several children who had been through the center returned to participate, some now young adults with their own families. When it ended, Jessica approached Melissa to say goodbye. "Mel, I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You don't need to thank me. You just need to continue the work." "What if I make a mistake? What if I can't be as good a director as you were?" "Jessie, you know these children's pain because you've lived through the same pain. That gives you an advantage no diploma can teach. Trust your instinct and your heart." They hugged once more. Melissa got in the car with Brandon and waved through the window. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. 2 years passed. Melissa had implemented the center model in 12 different cities, trained hundreds of staff members, and helped thousands of children. During one of her supervision trips, she received a call from Jessica. "Mel, you need to come here urgently," she said, excited. "Did something happen?" "Yes, something did. Something very good." Melissa cancelled her appointments and traveled back to Denver. When she arrived at the center, she found Jessica waiting at the door with a huge smile. "What happened?" asked Melissa. "Come with me," said Jessica, leading her to the main hall. Inside, there was a surprise party. All the children from the center, staff, former residents of the children's home, and even some of the kids who had passed through there were gathered. "Surprise!" they all shouted together. Melissa was confused. "Surprise for what?" Jessica grabbed an improvised microphone. "Everyone, you know that Melissa created this center and saved the lives of many children. What you might not know is that she also saved my life." The audience fell silent. 5 years ago, I was a bitter, cruel person who stole money from orphaned children. Mel could have destroyed me, could have sent me to prison and thrown away the key. Jessica looked at Melissa. But she chose to give me a second chance. And not just that, she taught me that it's possible to transform our pain into something beautiful. She made a sign, and one of the children brought a covered painting. That's why, on behalf of all the children who have been helped here, we want to pay tribute. Jessica removed the cloth covering the painting. It was a portrait of Melissa painted by the children themselves, with the phrase, "To the one who taught us that every child deserves love and every person deserves a second chance." Melissa began to cry. "You didn't have to." "Yes, we did," said one of the teenagers from the center, taking the microphone. "Because you taught us that our story doesn't define who we can become." The party lasted for hours. As it was winding down, Melissa and Jessica sat outside, watching the children play in the yard. "Jessie, can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "Are you happy now?" Jessica smiled. "You know what's funny? When I had money, expensive clothes, a luxury apartment, I was never happy. I always needed something more to feel complete. And now? Now I wake up every day knowing that I'm going to help children who are going through the same hardships I went through. I'm going to give them what I always wanted to have, someone who believes in them." "And that makes you happy?" "It gives me peace, and I've discovered that peace is much better than temporary happiness." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the activity. "Mel, can I tell you something?" "Go ahead." "Last month, 3 children who went through the center got full scholarships to universities. One of them wants to be a psychologist, just like me. Another wants to be a business person, just like Brandon. And the third wants to be a social worker, just like you." Melissa smiled. "And what does that prove?" "That we really managed to break the cycle. These children won't perpetuate the pain they received. They'll transform it into something positive, like we did. Like we did." The sun was setting, and the children started going inside for dinner. Melissa got up to leave. "Jessie, just one more question." "Go ahead." "If you could go back in time and change that day at the restaurant, would you change it?" Jessica thought for a long time before answering. "No, because if I changed that day, I might never have gotten here. I might never have learned what I learned, never have helped these children. Even knowing all the pain you caused?" "The pain was real, and it was terrible. But the growth that came from it was also real. And now I can use that experience to prevent other children from going through what I went through." Melissa nodded. "That's wisdom. That's grace. Undeserved grace, but received anyway." They hugged once more. As Melissa was leaving, Jessica shouted from the door, "Mel!" "What?" "Thank you. For everything." Melissa waved and got into the car. As she drove through the streets of Denver, she thought about how unpredictable life was. 5 years earlier, she was on her knees on a restaurant floor, humiliated and desperate. Now she was nationally recognized for her work with vulnerable children, and the woman who had humiliated her was dedicating her life to helping other children avoid the same hardships. Sometimes, the greatest transformations came from the most painful moments. The following semester, Melissa received a special invitation. Jessica was graduating in psychology and wanted her to be the class's commencement speaker. "Are you sure?" Melissa asked over the phone. "Shouldn't it be someone from the academic field?" "Mel, you were my first and most important teacher. You taught me everything I know about forgiveness, redemption, and transformation. I couldn't imagine anyone else." The graduation ceremony was emotional. When Melissa took the stage to deliver the commencement address, she saw dozens of familiar faces in the audience: center staff, children who had grown up there, former residents of the children's home. "Dear graduates," she began, "you've chosen a profession that deals with the human mind and heart. It's an enormous responsibility and a rare privilege." She looked directly at Jessica. "Some of you, like me, learned about human psychology, not just from books, but from life itself. You know what it's like to hit rock bottom and have to find the strength to climb back up. That experience, however painful it may have been, can become your greatest professional tool. Because when you've been through the darkness yourself, you can help others find the light." The audience was completely silent. "Always remember that every person who seeks your help was once a child who had dreams, fears, hopes. Treat that person not just as a clinical case, but as a complete human being who deserves respect and dignity." When she finished her speech, the audience rose in applause. Jessica was crying and clapping at the same time. At the post-graduation party, they talked at length about the future. "Jessie, have you thought about what you'll do now that you've graduated?" "Actually, I have a proposal for you." "What kind of proposal?" "What if we open a community clinic attached to the center, to serve not just the children but their families too?" Melissa was excited by the idea. "That would be a more comprehensive approach." "Exactly. Often children's problems reflect unresolved family issues. If we can help the entire family, the chances of success increase dramatically." They developed the project over the following months. Brandon provided financial support, and Richard helped with legal matters. In less than a year, the community clinic was operating. The results were surprising. Families that were falling apart managed to rebuild themselves. Aggressive children became affectionate. Teenagers in conflict with the law redirected their energies toward constructive activities. The work caught the attention of universities and international organizations. Melissa and Jessica were invited to speak at various events, always sharing their own story as an example that transformation is possible. During one such lecture, held in New York for an audience of social workers and psychologists, an audience member asked a question that deeply marked them. "Dr. Jessica," said a young woman, "how can you work with the person who reported you? Don't you feel anger?" Jessica looked at Melissa before answering. "Do you know what the greatest lesson I learned from this experience was? That we can choose to see people either for the worst they've done or for the best they're capable of becoming." But isn't that naive? No, it's strategic. When you see someone only for the mistakes they've made, you're limiting that person's growth possibilities. When you see the potential, you're creating space for transformation. Melissa completed. Besides, forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or accepting unacceptable behaviors. It means refusing to carry the weight of anger indefinitely. And how do you know when someone has truly changed? "Through actions," answered Jessica. "Real change manifests in consistent actions over time, not just in pretty words." After the lecture, they had dinner together at a restaurant in downtown New York. "Mel, can I tell you something funny?" "Of course." "This morning, when I was getting ready for the lecture, I looked in the mirror and for a second didn't recognize myself." "What do you mean?" "I remembered the woman I was a few years ago, bitter, cruel, dishonest, and I couldn't connect that person with who I am today." "And does that bother you?" "No, actually, it makes me grateful. It makes me grateful for having had the chance to become a better person." "You know you earned that chance, right? Nobody forced you to change." "I know, but you showed me the way." They finished dinner and walked through the busy streets of New York. "Jessie, there's something I've always wanted to ask you, but never had the courage." "Go ahead." "Deep down, did you know it was me that day at the restaurant, before I identified myself?" Jessica stopped walking. "I suspected. There was something familiar in your way of speaking, in your gaze, but I was so focused on maintaining my character that I didn't want to admit it." "Character?" "The successful, superior Jessica, who had never been an orphan. It was a mask I had worn for so long that sometimes I forgot who was underneath it. And when did you realize it was really me?" "When you mentioned Annie's doll, only someone who was there at that time would know that detail." "And what did you feel?" "Panic. Fear that my past would be revealed. But also a strange sense of relief." "Relief?" "From finally being able to stop pretending to be someone I never was." They arrived at the hotel where they were staying and said goodbye in the elevator. "Mel, thank you for letting me tell our story today." "Our story?" "That's what it is now, our story. No longer the story of the victim and the perpetrator, but the story of two women who found a way to transform pain into growth." The next day, on the flight back to Denver, Melissa reflected on everything that had happened in recent years. Her life had completely changed since that humiliating day at the restaurant. But the most remarkable thing was realizing how pain had transformed into purpose. Humiliation had become motivation, and anger had turned into compassion. When she got home, she found a message on her phone. It was from one of the first children who had been through the center, now a 20-year-old young woman. "Aunt Mel, I just passed the entrance exam for social work. I want to work with children like you do." Thank you for showing me that our origin doesn't determine our destiny." Melissa smiled and put away the phone. That message was worth more than any award or recognition she could receive. That evening, she called Brandon to tell him about the lecture in New York. "How was the audience's reaction?" he asked. "Very good. I think our story really inspires people." "Mel, can I make a confession?" "Of course. When I filmed that scene at the restaurant, I didn't imagine I was documenting the beginning of such a profound transformation." "Why did you film? What was your instinct?" "Honestly, anger. Anger at seeing one person humiliating another publicly. I thought about using the video to expose the woman." "And what changed your mind?" Your reaction, the way you chose to handle the situation. It made me realize there was an opportunity for something bigger there." "Bigger how?" "To create something constructive from something destructive. To transform an injustice into social justice." They talked for another hour about future plans. The center's model was being replicated in several states, and there was international interest. "Mel, have you ever stopped to think about the number of lives that were impacted by that moment in the restaurant?" Melissa had done the math a few times. Between the children directly served, their families, the trained staff, and the benefited communities, it was thousands of people. "It's impressive how a single moment can generate so many positive consequences." "You know what amazes me the most," said Brandon. "It's that everything started with someone choosing to forgive instead of seeking revenge." "It wasn't exactly forgiveness at first," admitted Melissa. "At first it was more of a strategy. The forgiveness came later, when I understood that carrying anger only hurt me. But it was a choice, and that choice changed everything." After the call, Melissa went to her apartment balcony and watched the city. Denver was illuminated on the cold winter night. She thought of all the children who were sleeping at the center that night, safe, fed, loved. She thought of Jessica, who was probably finalizing some report or planning the next day's activities. She thought about how different her life was now. 5 years earlier, she could barely pay the rent for a small room. Now she had a solid career, professional recognition, and most importantly, a clear purpose. But what moved her the most was knowing that she had helped another person find their own purpose. Jessica had become not only a competent employee, but a natural leader who inspired the entire team. That same week, they had a meeting to discuss new projects. "Mel, I have an idea I want to share with you," said Jessica. "Tell me. What if we wrote a book, telling our complete story?" "For what?" "To show other people that transformation is possible, that no matter how far you've fallen, there's always a chance to start over." Melissa liked the idea. "But it would have to be an honest book, without romanticizing the mistakes or minimizing the pain." "I agree. Show the real process of transformation with all the difficulties." They started working on the book during nights and weekends. It was a painful process at times, recalling details they would rather forget, but it was also therapeutic. "Jessie, do you remember exactly what you were feeling when you humiliated me that day?" "Anger. A lot of anger, but not necessarily at you." "At who then?" "At myself. At my past. At the feeling that I would never be able to completely escape the orphan girl I had been." "And humiliating others made you feel better?" "Temporarily, yes. It gave me a sense of power, of control, as if I were superior. But it didn't last. It never lasted. In fact, it made me feel worse afterward, because deep down I knew I was being cruel for no reason." These conversations during the writing of the book deepened their mutual understanding even further. The book was finalized in 8 months and published by a publisher specializing in real stories of overcoming. The launch was held at the center itself, with the presence of all the children, staff, and people who had been part of the journey. "This book," said Melissa during the launch, "is not just our story. It's the story of anyone who has made mistakes, regretted them, and decided to try to be better." The book had a surprising impact. They began receiving letters from people across the United States, sharing their own stories of transformation. One of the letters that moved them the most came from a 50-year-old woman from rural Colorado. "Dear Melissa and Jessica, I read your book and cried from beginning to end. 10 years ago, I was a bitter person who treated everyone around me badly. I lost friends, family, opportunities. But after reading about Jessica's transformation, I decided that I could change too. Today I work as a volunteer at a nursing home, and I'm a completely different person. Thank you for showing me it's never too late to start over. Mel, said Jessica after reading this letter together, do you realize what we're building? What? A network of people who believe in transformation. A community of second chances. That's how the idea for the Second Chance Institute came about, a national organization connecting people who wanted to change with mentors who had already gone through the transformation process. The institute grew quickly. Within 2 years, they had representation in 15 states and had helped over 1,000 people rebuild their lives. At one of the Institute's national meetings held in Washington, D.C., Melissa was invited to a panel about public policies for social reintegration. Dr. Melissa, asked a congressman, what's the main difficulty in implementing second chance programs on a national scale? Prejudice, she answered without hesitation. Society struggles to accept that people who made mistakes can truly change. And how do we overcome this prejudice? With concrete examples, showing real, measurable, sustainable transformations over time. Jessica, who was in the audience, asked to speak. May I give a personal testimony? 6 years ago, I was someone who stole money from orphaned children. Today, I'm the director of a center serving those same children. Transformation is possible, but it requires 3 things: opportunity, support, and time. How much time? Asked another congressman. In my case, it took about 2 years to change surface behaviors and nearly 5 years for a deep and stable transformation. And what guarantees the change is genuine? Melissa returned to the microphone. What guarantees it is the result? Jessica has been working with vulnerable children for 4 years. There's never been a single complaint about her behavior. On the contrary, she's one of the most beloved and respected staff members. The panel resulted in the creation of a federal government pilot program based on the Institute's model. The program would initially be implemented in 10 cities. Mel, said Jessica on the flight back to Denver, have you ever stopped to think we're influencing national public policies? It's surreal, right? It all started with a restaurant fight. It wasn't a fight. It was a moment of revelation. Revelation? Of what each of us could become. You discovered your ability to lead and transform systems. I discovered my ability to transform myself and help others. And now? Now we have the responsibility to use this influence wisely. Back at the center, they found news waiting. One of the teenagers they served had won a full scholarship to study medicine. Aunt Jessie, Aunt Mel, the girl shouted when she saw them. I made it. I'm going to be a doctor. It was Beatrice, a 17-year-old girl who had arrived at the center at 12 after her parents were arrested for drug trafficking. She was aggressive, distrustful, and wouldn't accept help from anyone. What do you mean, doctor? Asked Melissa, pretending not to understand the emotion. I won a full university scholarship. I'm going to study medicine and then come back to work with poor children. Jessica hugged the girl with tears in her eyes. Bea, do you remember when you first arrived here? You said you'd never achieve anything in life because you were the child of criminals. I remember. And you said our origins don't determine our future. And you believed it? I didn't believe it at first, but you proved it. You showed that Aunt Jessie had changed, that other kids had succeeded. Then I thought, if they could do it, so can I. That night, Melissa and Jessica stayed up late talking about Beatrice and all the other children who had passed through the center. Jessie, do you know the most important thing we've learned these years? Tell me, that our personal story can become a tool to help other people. Our pain wasn't in vain if it serves to prevent others from going through the same pain. Or to show that it's possible to overcome it. Exactly. They stayed a few minutes in silence, watching the stars through the office window. Mel, can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Of course. Sometimes I have nightmares about who I was before. I dream that I become that cruel and selfish person again. And that worries you? A lot. I'm afraid that one day I might go back to being who I was. Melissa thought carefully before answering. Jessie, do you think I'm not afraid of going back to who I was? A bitter, resentful person, focused only on surviving. You have that fear? I do, but I've learned that fear can be an ally. It keeps me alert, reminds me to make conscious choices every day. Conscious choices? Choosing to forgive instead of holding on to anger. Choosing to help instead of just complaining. Choosing to see people's potential instead of focusing only on their flaws. And you think that's enough? I think that's what we have. And so far it's worked. 2 months later, they received a special invitation. The UN wanted to include the Institute's model in the International Social Reintegration Program. Does this mean our approach can be used in other countries? Asked Jessica. It means they believe in the potential of our work, answered Melissa. But it also means an even greater responsibility. They spent weeks preparing for the presentation in New York. It was the first time both had traveled abroad. On the day of the presentation, Melissa was more nervous than ever. She was about to speak to representatives from 50 countries about a project that had started in a Denver restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, I want to tell you about a woman who once publicly humiliated me and how that humiliation became the foundation of a social program that now serves thousands of people. The audience was in absolute silence as she told the whole story, from the incident at the restaurant to the development of the Institute. When she finished, it was Jessica who took the stage. My name is Jessica Parker, and I am the woman who humiliated Melissa in that restaurant. I am also the woman who embezzled $200,000 intended for orphaned children. And today I am the director of a center that serves those same children. The audience remained silent. I'm here not to apologize once again, but to testify that human transformation is possible, real, and measurable. If I could change, anyone can. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause. Several people stood up. Some were crying. The program was approved unanimously. On the flight back to the United States, they could hardly believe what had happened. Jessie, do you realize we just influenced international social policies? I do, and I also realize the responsibility that comes with it. What kind of responsibility? To continue being living examples that transformation works. If either of us regresses, it could compromise all the work. Does that scare you? A little. But it also motivates me. Knowing that our story can inspire people all over the world gives me energy to keep growing. Back at the center, they found a surprise. The children had prepared a welcome party and a panel with photos of all the former students who had gotten jobs, scholarships, or started families. How many people in total? Asked Melissa, looking at the panel. 143, answered one of the staff members. Children who passed through here and now have stable lives. Jessica looked at each photo carefully. Mel, each of these photos represents a story that could have ended badly and ended well, and many other stories that are still being written. They watched the children playing in the yard. Some had just arrived and were still wary. Others were already integrated and helping their new classmates. You know what moves me the most about all this? Said Melissa. What? Seeing that we've managed to create a place where children learn from an early age that it's possible to turn pain into growth. How so? Look at Beatrice over there, helping that new boy. She came here angry, aggressive. Today she teaches others that change is possible. She became a living example. Like the two of us. They watched the scene for a few minutes. Beatrice was patiently talking to a boy about 10 years old who had arrived the previous week. Aunt Jessie, shouted Beatrice when she saw them. Can I introduce Michael to you? The boy hid behind Beatrice, clearly afraid. Michael, these are the aunts who created this place, Beatrice said affectionately. They also grew up in children's homes like us. The boy looked at Melissa and Jessica with curiosity. You didn't have families either? He asked. We didn't, replied Melissa, crouching down to his level. But we discovered that family is something we can build. How? By taking care of each other, helping when someone needs it, forgiving when someone makes a mistake. The boy thought for a few seconds. "And are you family to each other now?" Melissa looked at Jessica and smiled. "Yes, we are. A very special family that started with an ugly fight but turned into something beautiful." "Can I be part of this family too?" "Of course you can," said Jessica. "In fact, all the children here are our family." Michael smiled for the first time since he had arrived. That night, after all the children had gone to sleep, Melissa and Jessica had their last conversation of the day, as they always did. "Jessie, have you ever imagined what our lives would be like if I hadn't forgiven you?" "I imagine it would be much worse, for both of us." "Why?" "You would carry the anger forever, and that would make you bitter. I would keep being defensive, lying and stealing to keep up appearances. And now? Now we have purpose, peace, fulfillment. And most importantly, we have the certainty that our lives make a difference. You know what I've discovered over these years?" "What?" "That forgiveness isn't a feeling. It's a decision you make every day." "How so?" "Some days I wake up and still feel angry about that moment in the restaurant, but then I choose to forgive again, consciously." "And does it get easier?" "It does. Nowadays, the anger appears very rarely, and when it does, it only lasts a few minutes. The same thing happens to me with guilt. Some days I wake up feeling guilty for everything I did, but then I choose to focus on what I can do today to make amends. And is that enough? It allows me to sleep in peace and wake up with energy to help more people." They said goodbye and went to their homes. The next morning, as always, they would be back for another day of work with the children. 6 months later, the center received a special visit. Mrs. Helen, the former cook from the children's home who had been deceived by Jessica years before, appeared at the door. "Mrs. Helen!" shouted Jessica upon seeing her, running to hug her. "My child," said the elderly lady, returning the hug. "I came to see this place you've created." Mrs. Helen, now 75 years old, spent the entire day at the center talking with the children, helping in the kitchen, observing all the activities. "Jessica," she said late in the afternoon, "when you came to me years ago to sign those papers, I sensed something was wrong, but you seemed so desperate. You knew I was lying. I suspected, but I thought, this girl is suffering. She needs help, not judgment. And you weren't angry when you found out the truth. I was sad. It's sad to see you were so lost. But anger? No. Why? Because I watched you grow up at the children's home. I saw you suffering with the other girls. I saw you trying to protect yourself by being cruel. I knew that beneath that toughness was a hurt little girl." Melissa, who was listening to the conversation, was moved. "Miss Helen, did you always know that people can change?" "My dear, I worked for 40 years with orphaned children. If I didn't believe people can change, I would have given up on the first day. And what do you think of the work we're doing here?" Ms. Helen looked around, watching the children playing, studying, being cared for. "I think you've understood what I always tried to teach, that love isn't a feeling. It's action, and that every child, no matter where they come from, deserves a chance to be happy." That night, after Ms. Helen left, Melissa and Jessica stayed talking about the visit. "Jessie, did you notice how she talks about the children?" "I did. With so much affection, so much respect. She never refers to their past as a limitation, always as a starting point." "That's true. For her, the fact that a child is orphaned isn't a problem. It's a circumstance that requires special care. I think we need to learn that approach." "How so?" "Sometimes we still talk about our past as something we overcame. What if we started talking about it as something that prepared us for what we do today?" Jessica thought about the suggestion. "You mean instead of saying I was a bad person who changed, say I had difficult experiences that taught me about pain and transformation?" "Exactly, because our pain wasn't a flaw we fixed. It was a school that prepared us to help other people." This shift in perspective influenced all their work. They began to see every child who came to the center not as someone problematic who needed to be fixed, but as someone with unique experiences that could become strengths. The result was surprising. The children began to see themselves differently too, not as victims but as survivors with valuable stories to tell. 1 year later, the center was chosen as a model for an international documentary about innovation in social assistance. During filming, the director asked a question they had never received before. What was the exact moment when you realized you were more than former enemies working together? Melissa and Jessica looked at each other. I think it was when we stopped seeing each other as the victim and the aggressor, said Melissa, and we started seeing each other as two women who had learned different lessons about life and could teach each other, Jessica added. Can you give an example? Mel taught me about forgiveness, perseverance, and leadership, said Jessica. I taught her about transformation, vulnerability, and the complexity of human motives. How so? Complexity of motives. Before knowing me, Mel believed people did bad things because they were bad. I showed her that sometimes people do bad things because they are scared, hurt, or lost. And did that change how you work with the children? Completely, Melissa replied. I stopped judging behaviors and started investigating causes. I stopped punishing and started treating. The documentary was released in 20 countries and brought even more visibility to the center's work. With the impact, they received an unexpected proposal to turn their experience into an educational television program. A TV show? Asked Jessica, incredulous. It would be a show where people who hurt each other try to find ways to turn conflict into collaboration, the producer explained. We don't want to exploit people's drama, said Melissa. It wouldn't be exploitation. It would be a demonstration that reconciliation is possible and beneficial for everyone involved. They decided to accept, but with strict conditions. The focus would always be on the solution, never on dramatizing the problem, and all the program's profits would go to social projects. The program Second Chance premiered 6 months later and became an unexpected success. Each episode featured two people who had hurt each other finding ways to turn pain into mutual growth. In the most emotional episode of the first season, they brought Mrs. Helen to talk about forgiveness and wisdom. Mrs. Helen, Jessica asked during the recording, how did you always know I could change? My dear, I didn't know you could change. I hoped you would want to change. And when someone wants to change, they always find a way. But what if the person doesn't want to change? Then you plant seeds of hope and wait. Sometimes it takes years, but eventually the seed sprouts. Did you plant seeds in me? I did. Every time you did something wrong at the children's home, I would say, Jessie, you're capable of better than that. You'd get angry at the time, but the seed remained. Melissa was moved hearing this. Mrs. Helen, did you do this with all the children? With everyone. Because every child needs someone who believes in their potential, even when they don't believe in it themselves. This episode went viral on social media, being shared by millions of people. With the program's success, they received an even bigger proposal: to create a corporate university focused on organizational and personal transformation. A university? Asked Jessica. It would be a place where companies send employees in conflict, where families learn to reconcile, where communities resolve long-standing disputes, the investor explained. The idea was too ambitious to refuse. They accepted but kept the center as the main headquarters and ensured there would always be free spots for people without means. Transformation University was inaugurated 3 years later on a campus built next to the original center. On opening day, Melissa gave an emotional speech. This university exists because two women decided it was more productive to build together than to destroy each other. If we could do it, anyone can. Jessica added, transformation isn't an event, it's a process. And processes require patience, dedication, and mutual support. That's what we offer here. The university grew quickly. In the first year, they graduated 50 conflict mediators. In the second, 100. In the third, 200. Alumni began opening university branches in their own cities, spreading the methodology across the country. In a 5-year evaluation meeting for the university, they reviewed the numbers. Over 1,000 people graduated, 300 conflicts resolved, 50 companies transformed. Mel, have you ever stopped to think that we started with a personal fight and ended up creating a social transformation methodology? I think about it every day, and I always come to the same conclusion. What conclusion? That the most painful moments in our lives can become the most important if we know what to do with them. And do you think we knew what to do? I think we learned by doing, and we're still learning. That same year, they received the highest recognition. They were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their contribution to conflict resolution and social transformation. Nobel? Asked Jessica, incredulous, when they received the notification. It seems surreal, doesn't it? Replied Melissa. 2 orphans from Denver nominated for the Nobel. Mel, regardless of the outcome, the fact that we were nominated is already a victory. Victory for what? For all the people who believe change is possible, for all the children who grow up thinking they don't have a chance, for all the people who made mistakes and want a second opportunity. They didn't win the prize that year, but the nomination brought even more visibility to their work. On the day of the Nobel ceremony, which they watched on television at the center, surrounded by the children, Melissa reflected. "Do you know what's more important than winning an award?" she asked the children. "What, Aunt Mel?" asked one of the girls. "It's knowing that our lives make a difference every day, that every child we help, every family that reconciles, every person who learns to forgive is a prize we win." "And have you won many of those prizes?" asked a boy. "Thousands," Jessica replied. "And the best part is we can keep winning them every day." That night, after the children went to sleep, they took stock of everything that had happened since that day at the restaurant. "How many years has it been?" Jessica asked. 8 years and 4 months, Melissa answered immediately. "Are you sure about that date?" "Yes, it was on January 15th. I remember because it was the anniversary of my biological mother's death." "You never told me that." "Yeah. That day I was particularly sensitive because of the date. Maybe that's why your humiliation affected me so much. And maybe that's why I was particularly cruel. I was handling my own wedding anniversary poorly, pretending to be happy in a relationship that was suffocating me. Do you think if it had been another day, another emotional state, maybe it wouldn't have happened the same way, or maybe it would have. Our paths crossed for a reason. Do you believe in destiny?" "I don't know. But I believe that some people come into our lives to teach us something important, and that when we're ready to learn, the teacher appears. So I was your teacher, and you were mine. You taught me about forgiveness, leadership, long-term vision. And you taught me about courage, transformation, and responsibility." They sat in silence for a few minutes, reflecting. "Jessie, there's something I've always wanted to know." "Go ahead." "Deep down, do you regret humiliating me that day?" Jessica thought carefully before answering. "I regret the cruelty, the way I did it. But I don't regret the consequences, because without that day, none of this would have happened." "And you? Do you regret forgiving me?" "Never. It was the best decision I ever made in my life. It changed who I am as a person and gave me a purpose I never imagined having." "So are we at peace?" "We're more than at peace. We're in gratitude." The following month, they received a special invitation from the UN to present their methodology at the Security Council as an alternative for resolving international conflicts. "International conflicts?" Jessica asked. "Do you think our approach works on that scale?" "It works on any scale where people are willing to choose growth over revenge," Melissa replied. The presentation was successful and resulted in the creation of a UN pilot program based on their methodology to be implemented in conflict regions. "Mel, do you realize where we've arrived?" "I do. And I also realize that every step was a natural consequence of the previous one." "How so?" "Forgiveness led to investigation. Investigating led to justice. Justice led to reconciliation. Reconciliation led to social work. Social work led to the transformation of other lives, and so on. It's as if we planted a small seed that turned into a forest." "Exactly. And now we have the responsibility to care for that forest." 2 years later, on the 10th anniversary of the restaurant incident, they decided to do something special, return to the landmark, the restaurant where it all began. The manager, Gregory, still worked there, now as the owner, since he had bought the establishment. "Melissa," he said, surprised to see them. "It's so good to see you." "Hi, Mr. Gregory. This is Jessica." Gregory Wilson felt embarrassed, clearly remembering the situation. "Ladies, may I offer you dinner on the house, of course?" They accepted and sat at the same table where the incident had occurred. "It's strange to be here," said Jessica. "Why?" "Because it's like two completely different people are sitting at this table." "They are. We've both completely changed," Gregory approached during dinner. "Can I say something?" he asked hesitantly. "Of course," replied Melissa. "That day, I regret not standing up for you. I was cowardly." "Mr. Wilson, if you had defended me, perhaps none of what happened later would have occurred." "How so?" "Sometimes we need to go through certain experiences to discover who we truly are and what we're capable of," Jessica added. "And sometimes the people around us do exactly what they need to do, even without knowing why. Do you forgive me for being passive?" "There's nothing to forgive," said Melissa. "You did what you thought you had to do at the time, and we did what we had to do afterward." When they left the restaurant, they walked through the streets of Denver talking about everything that had changed. "Jessie, do you have any regrets about these 10 years?" "Just one." "Which?" "Taking so long to ask for help. If I had sought therapy, support, guidance when I started embezzling the money, perhaps you wouldn't have hit rock bottom. And perhaps I wouldn't have learned the lessons I did. So it wasn't wasted time. It was necessary time." "And you? Any regrets?" "Holding on to anger for so long before learning to forgive. I wasted a lot of energy on resentment that I could have used for constructive things. But the anger also motivated you to investigate, to seek justice." "That's true. Every emotion had its purpose." They arrived at the center and found the children still awake, waiting for them. "How was dinner?" asked one of the girls. "It was a closing ceremony," replied Melissa. "Closing of what?" "Of the past. From today onward, everything is future." "And what will the future hold?" asked a boy. Jessica crouched down to his eye level. "It will have you growing up, studying, achieving your dreams. It will have other children arriving here and being cared for. It will have people learning that it's always possible to start over." "And will you stay here?" "We will," said Melissa. "This is our place in the world." That night, after all the children had gone to sleep, they sat on the center's porch watching the illuminated city. "Mel, there's a question I've always wanted to ask you." "Go ahead." "If you had known on the day of that humiliation everything that would happen afterward, would you still have forgiven?" Melissa thought for a long time. "You know that's a difficult question? Because the forgiveness I offered back then wasn't the same forgiveness I feel today." "How so?" "Back then I forgave as a strategy to achieve justice. Today I forgive out of gratitude for the growth the experience gave me." "And if it were today, knowing everything?" "Today I would forgive immediately, without hesitation, because I've learned that forgiving frees the one who forgives more than the one who is forgiven." "And me? If I had known that humiliating you would lead to all this transformation, would I still have done it? That's the most important question of all." "Why?" "Because it defines whether you've truly changed or merely adapted to circumstances." Jessica remained silent for several minutes. "No. Knowing the consequences, I wouldn't have done it. Because today I understand that hurting someone is always wrong, regardless of the positive consequences that might arise later. And that means you've truly changed." "How do you know?" "Because the person you were before would justify any cruelty if there was some later benefit. The person you are today understands that the means matter as much as the ends." They remained in silence for a few more minutes, contemplating the view. "Jessie, do you know the most important thing we've learned?" "Tell me." "That our lives gain meaning when we use our experiences, both good and bad, to help others. And that there's no useless experience, only experiences not yet transformed into learning." "Exactly." The conversation was interrupted by a child's cry. They went inside to see what was happening and found Michael, the boy who had arrived at the center years earlier, comforting a little girl who had just arrived. "What happened?" asked Melissa. Lily had a nightmare, explained Michael. She was scared. And you're taking care of her? I'm doing what you did for me when I arrived, showing her she's safe now. Melissa and Jessica exchanged glances, moved. Michael, do you remember how you felt when you got here? I do. I was very scared and very angry. I thought everyone would hurt me. And what changed? You showed me that not everyone is bad, that some people hurt because they're hurt, and others help because they were helped. And now you're helping Lily. Now I am what you were to me. After calming the girl and returning to the porch, they reflected on the conversation with Michael. Mel, do you realize what just happened? What? Michael understood the cycle. He was transformed and is now transforming others. That's how change perpetuates itself, not just through our direct action, but through the actions of those who are transformed. And those people will transform others who will transform others. It's an exponential growth movement. And it all started with two women deciding to turn pain into growth. No, corrected Melissa. It started with one woman deciding to forgive and another deciding to change. The consequences came later. But were the decisions simultaneous? No. I decided to forgive first. You decided to change afterward. But both decisions were necessary. What if one of us had given up along the way? I don't know, but I know neither of us gave up. Why? Because we discovered we had something bigger than ourselves to fight for. The children? The children, the families, the possibility that others wouldn't have to go through the same pains we did. They talked a while longer, planning new projects, dreaming of future expansions. Jessie, there's one more thing I want to know. What? Are you happy? I'm fulfilled, and I've discovered that fulfillment is much more lasting than happiness. What's the difference? Happiness depends on circumstances. Fulfillment depends on purpose. And what is your purpose? To use my transformation experience to help others discover they can transform too. And yours? To use my forgiveness experience to show that it's always possible to restart human relationships. They're complementary purposes. They are. And that's why we work well together. When they finally said goodbye and went home, each carried with them the certainty that they had found not just peace, but meaning. The next day they received a letter that moved them deeply. It was from Beatrice, the former student who had become a doctor. Dear Aunts Mel and Jessie, I want to share some news. I've just been accepted for a specialization in social pediatrics. I want to work with children in vulnerable situations, like you worked with me. I learned from you that our origin doesn't determine our destiny, but it can determine our purpose. Thank you for showing me it's possible to turn pain into a life mission. With love and admiration, Beatrice. Mel, this is what I call a complete victory. Why? Because we didn't just save one life, we empowered that life to save others. And so the circle closes and begins again at the same time. Exactly. They framed the letter and hung it on the office wall, alongside dozens of similar letters from former students who had found their own paths of transformation. Each of these letters represents a life that changed direction, said Melissa, and every life that changes direction will influence other lives. It's a legacy that multiplies on its own, and one that will continue long after we're gone. That afternoon, during a team meeting, one of the newest staff members asked an interesting question. Do you think our methodology works because you two have lived what you teach? Partially, replied Jessica. But it also works because we don't try to hide our imperfections. What do you mean? Many social programs are created by people who want to help others as if they were superior. Our program is created by people who know that we all need help at some point, Melissa added. And because we understand that transformation isn't a destination, it's a journey. We're both still transforming every day. Do you still discover new things about yourselves? Constantly, answered Jessica. Yesterday I discovered I have the patience to deal with rebellious teenagers. 10 years ago, I would have given up on the first day. And I found that I can lead without being authoritarian, said Melissa. Something I didn't think was possible. These ongoing discoveries kept their work always fresh and dynamic. They didn't see themselves as experts who had all the answers, but as permanent students of human transformation. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe forgiveness can transform lives like it did for Melissa and Jessica? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.